Hi, I'm James Hamilton from Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, and today I'll show you how to cut a variably spaced joint with my unique incremental box joint jig, and then I'll give you some tips to build it. If you aren't familiar with the most recent box joint jig I made, it's a lead screw based system that works much like Incra's table saw and router table fences, in that the interlocking teeth of the lead screw align with a pattern on the jig. I built another version of this jig a few years back, but this one has some unique features which are outlined in another video that I'll link to in the notes below this video in case you want to check that out. Do you need all these features? Nope. There are simpler ways to cut box joints for sure. But for me, building and using complex jigs like this are a lot of fun. It's sort of like people who like to build marble machines and other wooden gizmos. But with a jig like this, you not only get the fun of the build, but you also have a useful tool to use for a long time to come. I'll place a link in the notes also to a set of plans in case you want to build this jig for yourself. They aren't free, but it helps support the 100 or so free woodworking videos we make every year. Now let's look at how to cut this creative joint using the pattern feature on my jig. Then I'll give you some building tips. We're going to cut the whole joint with a regular 1/8 inch full kerf saw blade, but we're never going to stop and change the setup when the width of our fingers change. Keep in mind that anytime you cut finger joints with the saw blade rather than a dado set, you'll need to make sure that your blade will leave a flat bottom on the kerf. I'm using Freud's industrial flat grind rip blade, which is of high quality, but it's still affordable. I'll link to it in the notes below as well. For variably spaced fingers, we have to cut one side of the joint at a time. We can't stagger the workpieces like we would do with a regular box joint. The 1/4 inch section in one piece would overlap a 1/2 inch section on another. It just wouldn't work out. If we were making a box, we could cut 2 of the 4 sides at once, as long as the layout on both those sides match. But for the sake of this demo, we're going to cut one piece at a time. At the top of my pattern that I originally made for this jig, above all the standard joint layouts, you'll see marks every 1/8 of an inch, which is the width of my saw blade. I could just work from these marks, but I'm going to lay out a paper pattern specifically for this joint so you can see how that's done, and then you can make your own patterns later on for other joints. I'm attaching a strip of paper right over my pattern with double-sided tape, leaving those little 1/8 inch marks visible. You could use a piece of masking tape instead of paper, but I like to save the pattern for use later on. Just make sure your double-sided tape isn't too strong, or you'll have trouble getting your pattern off when you're finished. I use the cheap kind that you find in office supply stores for this. Now I'm going to use a fine point pen or pencil to lay out the joint. I'm starting about an 1/2 inch from the end of the paper and making a mark every 1/8 of an inch using the scale marks above. My joint will have 5 1/8 inch fingers, so I lay out 5 marks. From there I lay out 6 1/4 inch fingers, and finally 4 1/2 inch fingers. All of this adds up to 4 1/8 of an inch, which is the width of my stock. You can change the number or widths of your fingers if you like, just make sure it all adds up to the width of your stock. Since I only cut every other finger on any given side of the joint, I find it helpful to color in every other gap on my pattern. Then on the first half of the joint, I'm going to cut in all the dark spaces, and on the second half, I'll cut in all the light spaces. To set everything up, I release the quick release, and I slide the carriage so that the cursor lines are just to the right of my pattern lines. I engage the lead screw, and then I turn the crank to fine-tune the start position. Since I'm just using an 1/8 inch kerf blade, I only use 2 of those marks on the right. If I was using a 1/4 inch dado stack, I'd use 3 cursor lines and so on. These lines represent both sides of my saw blade, so I can always see exactly where the kerf will be in relation to the pattern marks. This helps me avoid cutting on the wrong side of my lines. My starting position is when those 2 cursor lines are to the right of my first pattern line. Then I'll slip my workpiece into the carriage, placing its edge right against the saw blade's teeth. Then I'll slide the fence over and lock it in place next to the workpiece. That fence helps keep the workpiece from getting nudged out of place as the carriage slides during the cut. And a clamp's a good idea too. On the first half of my joint, I'm going to cut all the dark parts out of my pattern, one kerf at a time. To move the carriage between cuts, I can either turn the crank, keeping an eye on my pattern as the cursor lines move from line to line, or I can unlock the lead screw and move the carriage by hand. I'm going to do it that way because I don't necessarily trust my eyes. So I want to use the built-in incremental positioner feature to take the air out of it for me. Every time I push down that handle, the interlocking threads auto-correct, nudging the cursor to the nearest 1/8 of an inch. So if I slide the carriage a little bit too far on my pattern, the positioner will fix it for me when I lock it down. After I've cut the 1/8 inch dark areas, I move right into the 1/4 inch ones. This is done the same way, except it'll take 2 cuts for every dark area. As long as I look at my 2 cursor lines as if they were the 2 sides of my saw blade, it's easy to keep track of where the cut is going to be and when to stop cutting. The 1/2 inch fingers require 4 cuts to nibble out each dark area. A variably spaced joint like this can be a little tedious, but special joints always take a little more work. If I was cutting a regular joint with all the fingers the same size, I could put a dado set in and cut this thing much faster. After I finish all the dark spots on the pattern, I reset the cursor to the beginning, and then I put in my other workpiece right up against the tooth of the saw blade just as before. Then I repeat the same process, only this time I cut on the light areas of the pattern, working my way all the way across the joint. That's all there is to it. If I was making a box, I would cut 2 sides at once, cutting on all the dark areas on one end of the workpieces, then flipping them end for end and doing the same thing on the other ends. Then I'd repeat the process with the other 2 sides of my box, cutting the light spaces on the ends and then flipping end for end and cutting the light spaces again. Now that we've done a variably spaced joint, what about inlaid joints? We talked about that in a previous video. Well, I'm still experimenting with those. The problem is that parts of the inlay end up being end grain and other parts long grain. And when you put a finish on it, the end grain's darker and it just does not look good. When you see the guy in the Incra video on YouTube, there's an old video where he's making inlaid joints. He's running one of his workpieces flat on the router table rather than standing up on end. And that's not really practical in a box joint jig, but I'm going to keep playing with it. Now, when we released the plans for this jig on our website, I forgot to include the process for attaching a runner. It's done the same way as on a table saw sled. In fact, I made a video about table saw sled runners some time ago. I'll put a link to that below as well. The footage you see here is from that video, but the box joint jig works the same way. You just put your runner in the miter track, using some washers underneath so that it'll be up above the surface of your table saw top. Put some double-sided tape on the runners. Then, as you set your jig onto the saw, keep the end flat against the table saw fence, in the same way that I'm keeping the edge of the table saw sled against the fence here. That'll help square the jig to your saw blade as you place it on the runner. Of course, you'll want to set the fence so that the jig will land in the right place on top of your saw in relation to the blade. It's not critical, but I set my fence 21 3/8 of an inch from the blade. That made the kerf fall right about in the center of the 2 inner support blocks. I only attached 1 runner to my jig, and I used screws to secure it, not just the tape. There are a couple of other things you should keep in mind as you build. For one thing, the toggle clamp that makes up the positioner cannot be allowed to move from side to side at all. That will introduce air into the joint. So when I attached the brackets, the wooden brackets on either side, I made sure that they were tight against the wood block on the toggle clamp. And I made sure the brackets themselves were secured to the body of the jig so that they would not move. I don't recommend gluing them down since you might want to make changes later on, but use screws to keep them in place. If the width of your fingers are inconsistent, it's probably because the toggle clamp is moving from side to side, so make sure it's secure. Also, you want the carriage to move freely so the incremental positioner can work properly. If you unlock the toggle clamp and the carriage doesn't slide really easily from side to side like you would expect a ball bearing drawer slide to do, then your sides are binding. Use a combination square to be sure all 4 corners of the carriage are the same height against the jig's base panel. That'll tell you if both sides of the jig are on the same level and if both are parallel to the base. And be sure that the distance between the front and the rear slide are the same on both ends of the carriage so that it's not pinching as the carriage slides. If you built your jig carefully, these things aren't going to be an issue, but mistakes do happen, so you can loosen the adjustment screws and shim the front or the back of the jig to realign the carriage if you have to. Those adjustment screws are noted in the downloadable plans. Finally, when you attach your pattern, whether it's the one included with the plans or one you make yourself, you don't have to fuss over its position. Just place it so that when the carriage is slid all the way to the right, the cursor lines will be past the first mark on your pattern. It doesn't really matter how far past because, as we showed you earlier, you're going to adjust that to the right position for the joint that you're cutting. You just want to make sure that your cursors, when the carriage is all the way to the right, aren't already in the center of your pattern because you won't be able to use the whole pattern then. I hope you had fun building and playing with this jig, and I hope it inspires you to build more complex jigs on woodworking machines. I know I enjoyed it. For more plans, check out the homemade tools section at stumpynubs.com. And while you're there, subscribe to Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always full of free tips, tricks, techniques, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker. Happy jigging!